So, where are we today? I was recently sitting on a street bench outside the National Gallery of Victoria. It was adjacent to the water feature in front of the building, and it was soon after the death of Jerzy Grotowski. By all accounts, here was an extraordinary Australian artist, yet at the end of his days, he'd been reduced to wading through the water in front of me to collect coins in order to survive. There's still far too much power and money that has been designated for arts practice in the hands of bureaucrats and administrators. The sad reality is that the public arts dollar is not going directly into the pockets of enough arts practitioners. It's certainly not going into the pockets of artists in the same sustained superannuated way that it goes into the pockets of arts administrators. I'm not attacking individual arts bureaucrats here, but I am attacking a system that is too top-heavy in administration. I remember having a coffee in the early 1980s with Dr. Timothy Pascoe at the Performance Space. It was soon after his appointment to the role of Executive Chair of the Australia Council. I was a little embarrassed at having to wash a dirty cup to serve him a coffee. I apologised for the untidiness of the place, and his reaction was sublime. He said, "Mike, it's not the state of the venue that's important. It's the quality of the work that comes out of the building. That's the important part." These days, there seems to be too little direct communication and interaction between the bureaucrats and the practitioners. There's a sense of a castle syndrome, where the artist has to negotiate the lowering of the drawbridge from the other side of the moat. The period of investigation of this research project finishes in 1986. In 2010, nearly a quarter of a century later, there's a lot more money invested in the arts, both from government organisations and corporate and philanthropic sources. There's a lot more venues, more equipment and other resources available for use. But we need to start to question what's going on and to find out ways of gauging the progress against some sort of definition of cultural objectives. But how do we measure this progress? Let's take, for a moment, the yardstick as 1973 and the measurement of 37 years. Yes, we've travelled far, but I will assert that we are still trying to buy a culture, and there has to be a philosophical shift from the buying a culture model to the invest in a culture model. Investment is a long-term strategy, and unlike the arts buildings that we have constructed over the past 37 years, investment in arts practice, new ideas, and original thinking does not have quick and easily definable returns. I'm pleased to see that the federal government is currently looking at a cultural policy. It's not a new idea, and it's been a long time coming. I remember this being talked about in the mid-1980s when Andrea Hull was the Director of Policy and Planning at the Australia Council. In 1994, we also came very close to having some form of cultural policy in Australia with the Keating government's Creative Nation document. It is my belief that an Australian cultural policy is the key to the development of an investment model. We are a country and a nation that, on the one hand, has some of the oldest living cultures on the planet, and, on the other hand, a culture that has emerged since European settlement that is still young, developing, and highly vulnerable to outside influences. We have to accept that we are still forming a cultural identity, and that process has to be carefully managed and nurtured. In October 2009, the Federal Arts Minister, Mr. Peter Garrett, released a discussion framework that outlines 10 broad-stroke concepts to be discussed as the foundations for a national cultural policy. I think that there is something important that is missing from the current approach. For a start, I believe that, first and foremost, we need to debate why we need a cultural policy. That's going to be harder, and I believe that we can't create a framework for a cultural policy until we have a clearly articulated reason why we need such a policy. Okay, let's say that we can thrash out the why, and then we've clarified the aims and objectives. But even then, there's another important step missing from the current approach. The cultural policy has to come with a 100-year plan. Such a plan would set out a number of goals to be achieved over a 100-year period. And those goals would need to be measured against every decade. In other words, if we have such a policy, it needs to be framed in a vision that none of us will ever live to see. The plan would be based in a vision for an Australian culture in 2110. The goals would then be set against each decade by working back from that point. My vision for 2110 is that some kid from a one-horse town near Wagga Wagga says, "I have an idea," and all doors are open to that idea. By 2110, that kid has been born into a culture that is very confident about what it is and what it stands for. In 2110, there are structures in place that respond easily to ideas, and there is a culture that celebrates originality and invention. In 2110, 100 years after the establishment of an Australian cultural policy, a boy from the rock near Wagga Wagga applies for an arts funding grant. He argues passionately and articulately in justifying the cost of this latest performative installation piece, which he argues can only be staged at the Australian outpost on the planet Mars, because of the connection between the red soil at the heart of the Australian continent and the red soil on Mars. All doors opened. The kid gets the grant.